My name is Dénes KRUSOVSZKY and I'm from Hungary, from Budapest, and I'm a poet. And besides poetry, I'm writing critics for literary magazines. I'm an editor of a book series, and also I'm a poetry editor for a literary quarterly, and I'm translating poetry. Well, actually, it was a kind of hobby, but now it turns to be a little bit more serious job, or something. And yeah, what else? I'm writing also. I wrote one theater piece, and it was staged last year. And I'm writing short stories. Sometimes it's a new thing after 4 volumes of poetry. But I wrote some short stories while I was here, so I was working on a completely new thing in my kind of writer's career while I was in Universit. I think in Hungary the best and the worst thing is almost the same. It's the language, which is a very small language, so it means that you as a writer have a small audience, a small domestic audience at least. Usually the Hungarian writers, if they want to have a more serious career, or perhaps more serious is not the right word for it, but like an international career, the first step is to have a German translation. So without that, you will be closed between the borders of Hungary, because it's a language spoken by those 10, 12 million people who lives in that part of Europe. And but from another point of view, it can be a good thing. I mean, it's like being in a exclusive club in a funny way. I mean, it's of course it's not exclusive in the word's original meaning, but like it's you can see the whole sphere sometimes, because it's small literature, but with very interesting parts and very interesting writers. So you don't feel yourself like in a cage, but in the same time you can see everyone. And sometimes you can, if there's a gathering or a literary festival, sometimes you can see really almost every writer in the same room, and it can be funny and it can be familiar, sometimes too familiar, when sometimes as a family can be annoying. The small literature can be annoying also. So perhaps, yeah, and the burden of the Hungarian literature is the Hungarian language, but every Hungarian writer, I think, thinks that they wouldn't change it because they love it. It's a very unique language in a way, not for us, of course, because this is our mother tongue, but it's a very interesting language, and I also like to use it. I cannot compare it to any other languages because I've always written in Hungarian, but I'm satisfied with it, and it's an interesting thing, interesting language and interesting tradition. About Budapest, I think to be a Hungarian writer, the best place, and perhaps for me at least the only really good place is Budapest. It's the only metropolitan-like city in the country where you can have everything in the same place, like every kind of literature, every kind of poetry, from slam to, I don't know, avant-garde voice poetry through page poetry, and also it's big enough to disappear if you don't want to meet with with anyone. So yeah, it's it's the only city where the Hungarian is the main language. So it's fun if you are a Hungarian writer. Budapest for me. The other thing would be like perhaps the Balaton Lake, which is a very literary place actually. Everyone goes there. It's the so-called Hungarian Sea, so everyone goes there because we don't have a seaside, so everyone goes to this lake. But they have a castle there. Actually, it belonged to the Esterházy family before the war, which is a literary thing because Péter Esterházy is one of the main contemporary writers in Hungary. But during the socialism, the government gave this whole castle to the writers. So now it's an artist residency. So everyone who is writing anything in Hungary happened to be there sometimes. And it's a very beautiful location, and I'm there every summer for a week when there's a gathering for young writers, and yeah, that's a really funny place, and it's far from everything. It's in a village, and it's like stepping out from time and real life for a week or for a month if you are lucky to spend a month there. Well, it's a tough question. I think, I don't know, I remember why I've started to write, because at one point in elementary school, I found poets. I found those poets who were interesting to me. The Hungarian school system is a little bit archaic or academic, so we start with Homer and then finish with the contemporary literature. So a long part of it is not that interesting for the young people. And then when you arrive to the 20th century, you realize, but it's the last year, so it's almost out of time, but you realize then that literature can be very interesting. And I read some poems, and I thought that I can, perhaps I can, or I would like to express myself in this way. And then I tried to. I failed, of course, but then I tried again, and it became kind of an obsession or an addiction. And now I don't know sometimes why I'm writing, I just have to write. So it became a part of my life or even my existence. It was, I remember, it was Miklós Radnóti, who was a Hungarian poet, and he died in the Holocaust, very young, and he's one of the most influential and famous poets of the 20th century in Hungary, and he was a very humanistic writer, and although it was the Second World War going on, he wrote eclogas and ideas and like in Latinic rhythm and metrics, and I was just amazed how someone can live a completely different intellectual and I don't know, life besides the history and politics and besides everyday. So how can you create your own world through your writing? That was really interesting from him. But for example, while I'm here, I really Joe Tiefenthaler, who is our leader here actually in Universit, he showed me a contemporary American poet, Dean Young, and then I bought his selected poems, and it's a really good book, and it's always very interesting to find someone who you feel very close to you, and but he's from a completely different language and culture and everything. So it was a big surprise and very good surprise for me to find him. And I don't know how else to say. Perhaps that's it. If I can tell you a name from the contemporary Hungarian literature, there's a poet, Szilárd Borbély, and I think he's one of really the most amazing poets of these times in Hungary. And I don't know if his poetry is translated to English. I'm sure some of it or most of it is translated to German, as I told you that German is the first language usually. Yes, yeah. I'm really much interested in fiction, and I have to say I cannot really divide it. I mean, of course there are genders and there are different kind of types of writing, but for me always was, literature, and just if you use the form of poetry or fiction, it doesn't really matter, but if it's the part of the literature, and also the criticism and the essayism is the part of it, so I don't like to divide it. Yeah, but yeah, I'm following fiction. I've just read the short story book of Don DeLillo, and it was really interesting. I just found out that he has only one short story book, which came out some years ago, 2 years ago, perhaps. Yeah, I think yes, and especially if we are talking about smaller literatures, or if your language and your literature is big enough, it's a word language and the word literature, because it's a word language, it's another question, but still it has to be financed sometimes. But if we are talking about a small literature as the Hungarian with a small audience, I think it's very important from the point of view of the state to finance it. But the fact is that there's a financing system in Hungary, but it's always always a scandalous thing, and always connected to politics and wings and something like that, and that's a bad thing. I think the original idea to have a national foundation for arts, it's a good idea, and I think it should be the way, but the system should contain some insurances that it will never go too close to the government or the political parties, and this is the hardest point, because always the politicians and politics want to use culture as a political weapon or tool. So it's a hard question, but I still think even there are scandals and arguments and everything all the time, that it's a very important thing. And I'm always watching the news, and it's all about how the government supports sports. And I always think that, okay, it's a fun thing to have sports club and stadiums, and I don't know, but it's more fun to have a good culture, and it's more cheap, so why don't they use it? Because it's not as popular, I know, but still they should think about it, I think. No, it's not my first time. I've been in some southern states when I was 12 with my parents, and it was a family trip. And I've been in New York 2 years ago for a month. So a lot of things is not as surprising now. But I was just talking with one of the guys from the translations workshop yesterday that it's a very funny thing how the Hungarians and the Central Europeans, I think, usually think about the United States, because that part of the United States which is there in their country usually is not the most typical part of the United States, or not even the most interesting part of it. But because it's there, they usually think that this is very typical. So then, for example, I live in the city center in Budapest, and on the same square there's a Subway, there's a McDonald's and a Burger King. And so Hungarians I think, that it is the same here. But if you come here, you will not see any kind of these fast food restaurants in the city, or not really, because it's for the highway and it's, you know, it's a different thing. So it's not a surprise, but it's always good to remind myself that you should go there and take a closer look on every kind of culture, not just the American, but while I'm here, I'm doing it here, because sometimes the image of the country is just a tricky thing. It's not what it is really. But it's always surprising how nice are the people, or how friendly they can be, especially here in the Midwest. It was really nice, and it was surprising for me when I was in Chicago, and if you stop for 5 seconds with the map in your hand, someone will come to you and ask you if you need any help, and that's, I think, not a typical thing in Central Europe. Well, sometimes I like when someone asks me, what is this about? Mm-hmm. Because I don't know, to be honest. I don't know sometimes when I'm writing a poem that what is it about? It's more self-leading something to, or self-driving something to write poetry. Mm. But it's still always an interesting question, the relationship between the writer's will and the outcome and the meaning. I don't know. My latest book is a poetry collection for children, and it's again a very interesting question, and I like to think about it, why I did write that, because I don't have children. And I was interested in the form and the different kind of mechanism, because I was never think about readers while I was writing. But now, if you write for children, you have to, because it's for children, and you have to decide the age of your audience, or you have to choose it. So actually for me it was an experiment, and it was a very funny experiment. I really liked to wrote those poems, so perhaps I will follow it. Really? I just need a coffee, I think. My name is Dénes KRUSOVSZKY, and I'm from Hungary, from Budapest, and I'm a poet for volumes of poetry. But I wrote some short stories while I was here, so I was working on a completely new thing in my kind of writer's career while I was in Universit. I think in Hungary the best and the worst thing is almost the same. It's the language, which is a very small language, so it means that you as a writer have a small audience, a small domestic audience at least. Usually the Hungarian writers, if they want to have a more serious career or perhaps more serious is not the right word for it, but like an international career turns to be a bit more serious job, or something. And yeah, what else? I'm writing also. I wrote one theater piece and it was staged last year. And I'm writing short stories. Sometimes it's a new thing after. And besides poetry, I'm writing critics for literary magazines. I'm an editor of a book series, and also I'm a poetry editor for a literary quarterly, and I'm translating poetry. Well, actually, it was a kind of hobby, but now